Morning and welcome to my garden. This picture hogging beast is Maisie, one of our two cats. Well, shedding fur as ever. What's the matter? Are you not getting enough attention? Oh dear. Anyway. Well, welcome to my garden in August. It's been a pretty traumatic month with the drought. And we've just had a bit of rain overnight, which has refreshed things mightily. I'm standing here in front of one of the three hydrangea paniculata varieties that we've got in the garden. And at this time of year, the hydrangeas, particularly the paniculatas, are one of the things that are doing their thing. They're a late summer or mid to late summer flowering thing. This one is Vanille Fraise, and this hasn't really, it's a fairly young plant, hasn't really got going, and the flower heads should be a lot bigger than they are. As it fades is the wrong word, because what it does as it goes over, it turns quite a deep pink from the white, and you initially get sort of pink and white together, and then they all go pink. So that's hydrangea there. In front of it is Crocosmia here. In front of that is one of the things that we put in to replace stuff that's gone over early, Cosmos. They have rather suffered in the weather this year. But I like Cosmos as a filler, because it always, you put it in there in May or June, and it comes up and it flowers, and it looks like it's always been there. It's got a very natural look about it. Some of the other things that we've used as fillers are not quite so, don't sort of slot in quite so comfortably. Moving on round. Fuchsia, big bush of Fuchsia magellanica here. The fuchsias come into their own at this time of year. We find that we get a lot of problems with capsid bug, which tends, as they make new growth in the spring, it tends to sort of damage a lot of the shoots. And I don't worry too much about that ordinarily, because I know that they will disappear midsummer, and the new growth that it makes later in the year will flower very freely and take me through from August until probably late September, October. Coming on round again, we've got tender perennials in pot, Plectranthus argentatus there. The filler here, replacing earlier Aquilegias, foxgloves, Geranium parmesum, which are annuals or biennials that seed and then finish in about early June. The fillers that we've put in to replace them are salvias, which are tender perennials that we've grown from cuttings, taken probably last autumn. The purple one is Amistad, absolutely fabulous plant, just flowers and flowers and flowers. It's almost unreal how much better it looks today than it did yesterday. The little bit of rain that we had overnight has made a tremendous difference. Just down to the left of it is a blue one, which is called, oh, excuse me while the seagulls go overhead. There's a blue one called Salvia Black and Bloom, which is sort of similar in shape. And then slightly hidden behind the salvia is a dahlia. We leave the dahlias in, but again I would regard them as sort of late flowering fillers. Right, there's a couple more dahlias here. The tall one is Karma Choc. Shorter one in front of it is called Impression Fantastico, a little collarette dahlia. One of the consequences of the very dry weather has been that the flowers on the dahlias have struggled and are much smaller than they would normally be, which is a bit of a shame. Right, I have a rain gauge which I don't use very systematically, but I was interested to know how much rain we had overnight. So I set it up, and we had 10.5 millimetres. Now 10.5 millimetres of rain is not a great deal, but it's useful. It's enough to penetrate into the ground. It came down fairly steadily over a long period, so it will have penetrated down deep enough not to evaporate as soon as the sun comes out. I'm a rain harvester. I have water butts and tanks, and collect rain from the roof of the house and the roofs of the various greenhouses that we've got. And I reckon I've worked it out. I have about 89 square meters of roof, and for each of those square meters, a millimeter of rain is a litre of water. So that 89 square meters and 10.5 millimeters is not far short of a cubic meter of water, nearly 1,000 litres of water. So that also is well worth having, adding into my storage. We've been here for about 34 years, and it started out as a green, well, entirely grassy space, and now the only grasses that we've got left now are a handful of ornamental grasses. It's a fair-sized garden, but surrounded, it's in a housing estate and it's surrounded by other houses. So this is going back to about 1987, 1988, when we first moved into the house. I think the house was then about 10 years old, and they'd done the garden, and laid grass, they'd planted a leyland hedge, they'd put 2 of each of about half a dozen different types of trees, and they'd done some hard landscaping, and that was about it. And that's taken at the same time, looking back towards the house. And so we sort of set to on that round lawn, cutting out beds. Still got the leyland hedge, trimmed a bit better. We'd put a polytunnel in at the top there, and we're growing veg at the time in this piece here. Sort of cut a wider bed round the edge, cut the beds in the lawn itself. We had a conifer bed. The beds then got expanded to leave just a grass path between them, which meant a very small amount of mowing and a very great amount of edging. So I tired of that very quickly and dug the grass bit out, and we put gravel in instead. So that was pretty much where it ended up, and it stayed like that for several years. I then put paving slabs around the outside ring and left the gravel on the inside bits, but put an edging on it. The tree that is now the big standard yew tree, I think is possibly this one. Oh, hello. This is one of a number of apple trees, or 3 apple trees I've got in the garden. At this time of year, I prune it. And ordinarily with a bush tree, you would winter prune. But what I've found with this one is that it works better if I summer prune it. So I'm using a technique which you would normally just use on trained trees like espaliers and cordons. And as you can see, you've got all this new growth, long whippy growths, 2-3 feet long, that it's made this year. And in the 3rd week of August, I'm pruning them back to pretty close to the bottom. So there's a sort of cluster of leaves very tightly right at the base of the stem, and I'm going 1, 2 or 3 leaves above that. On this shoot here, you can see that it's grown from there this year. You've got a basal cluster of 2 or 3 leaves, and then you would count 2 or 3 up from that and cut there. This is what was left from last year. So there was about 3 inches was left last year. It's the end bud that's grown out and produced this year's growth, and 2 of the buds slightly further back have grown a short shoot which has got now got a fat bud on it. That's next spring's flower buds. So that will produce next year's fruit. Shooting over, getting what I can reach from the ground. When I can't reach them from the ground any longer, I'll get my long-armed pruner and chop them with that. A couple of things in there. There's the orange at the front is French marigold called Bolero, and the yellow just above it is Cosmos sulphureus. The feathery thing that looks like a fern is Corydalis chylanthifolia. Verbena bonariensis photobombing the scene. More Cosmos and marigolds. Further up is a planting of dahlias. Worth bearing in mind that all of this is in its second year. This was an area that 2 years ago there was a polytunnel here. So it was planted up for the first time a year ago May. So it did pretty well. It did very much better last year. This year has been too dry. The dahlias, the one on the right is orange cushion. Going straight up from there, and as you can see behind the leaves are canna, and this is a variety called hen-laid seedling. Hen-laid being a place. I got in touch with Desert to Jungle to ask him about it, and he'd had it growing in the garden for many years, regards it as one of the hardiest cannas that he knows, but doesn't in fact know the parentage of it. We get a little bit of borrowed landscape here in that the thing behind it is an Australian bottlebrush in next door's garden, Callistemon. My plums have had a torrid year. They really haven't enjoyed the drought at all, and I don't eat them without cutting them in half first, because there's rather too many caterpillars of plum moth in them, and I'm vegetarian. One of the things that I'm getting into at the moment is begonias, notably hardy begonias. Plant collectors are still out in the world going around collecting plants, and in places like Taiwan, North Vietnam, Myanmar, northern India, at quite high altitude, they're finding species of begonias growing in the wild which are proving to be hardy in the UK. And here I've got a couple of them. This one is called Begonia tengchiana, which comes from China, and this is supposed to be hardy to -10. Now, hardiness, of course, is a minefield. It's not a simple matter of it being hardy to whatever temperature. It's where is it growing? Has it got cover overhead? Have you covered it over with a load of leaves? Is it going to die down? Has it had a dry summer or a wet summer? Is it still sort of inactive growth? There are all sorts of things that affect hardiness. So I'm not very trusting when people sell me something at 15 quid and tell me it's hardy, and I'm not likely to leave it outside in the first winter. What I like to do is to propagate it so that I've got a young plant and then leave it out and I've got backup. But anyway, tengchiana, typical begonia leaf, nothing particularly exciting. Small white flowers, pink on the reverse. That one came from a nursery called Farmyard Nurseries. They do quite a nice range. This one down here is one called Begonia baviensis, and this has got this extraordinary sort of red bristle covering over every part of the plant. All the midribs of the leaves, the stems, the flower buds are all covered in these little red bristles. This one comes from Taiwan and was a Krieg introduction. That's now got a flower on it. Right, this is another plant of Hydrangea paniculata. In this case I don't actually know which variety it is, but this was a nursery chuck-out plant. It was in a 3-litre pot, but just a single stem, about 3 feet high. And it was planted, and I cut the top off, left the one stem, cut the top off, and it branched, and I cut those shoots back at the end of the year, and they branched, and gradually over about 4 or 5 years it built up quite a nice head. So what it's actually got is a clear stem of about 3 foot and then a head on the top, which is nice because it means that I can plant 1 or 2 shade loving things underneath, and it's above the height of the stuff that's planted around it. So I've got a little Dahlia murkii in front of it there, not being hid by the hydrangea. Well, it's been very nice. It's been a real pleasure showing you around my garden. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you again in a month's time.